The northern prairie had a way of lying to people. In late September, the grass still bent green under the wind, and the sky carried that wide, forgiving blue that made men believe they had time. Time to finish a roof. Time to cut more wood. Time to fix mistakes later. Out here, time always felt larger than it really was. Along a shallow creek where half a dozen homesteads clung to the land, cabins were going up fast. Rough plank walls, tar paper stretched tight, light iron stoves hauled in by wagon and bolted into place with little ceremony. The goal was speed. Get a roof overhead. Get a fire burning. Survive the first winter, then improve later. Everyone worked with urgency. Everyone except one man. While neighbors raced to stack cordwood and seal their chimneys, Elias Holmgren was hauling stone. Not small stone. Not decorative stone. Heavy river rock, rounded and stubborn, dragged one load at a time from the creek bank. His wagon creaked under the weight. His boots sank deep into the cooling mud. Men passing by slowed their horses and stared. Stone was for foundations. Stone was for cellars. If you had time. Stone was not for late September, not when frost could arrive overnight. Yet there Elias was, laying out a square footprint inside his half-finished cabin, measuring carefully, setting the first stones as if winter were months away. Someone laughed and called it wasted effort. Another shook his head and muttered that the Scandinavian didn't understand how things were done out here. On the frontier, usefulness was measured by speed. If something didn't make you warm right now, it was considered unnecessary. Elias said nothing. He worked with the calm rhythm of a man following a plan that did not need defending. What the others didn't notice, what most men never noticed, were the signs already written across the land. Muskrat lodges along the creek stood higher than usual, packed thick with mud and reeds. The wind shifted earlier in the day, cutting sharp from the north even under clear skies. Nights cooled faster than they should have. These were small things, easy to ignore, easier still to dismiss as coincidence. But Elias had grown up where winters were not negotiated with. He did not build for the first cold night. He built for the worst one. By the time the first thin skin of ice formed in the wash basins at dawn, his neighbors were nearly finished. Their cabins looked complete. Fires burned bright behind iron doors. Smoke curled confidently from stovepipes, promising warmth. Elias's cabin looked unfinished. Stone rose slowly inside, silent and unimpressive to anyone who didn't know what it was meant to do. A week later, the sky changed. The blue faded. The horizon flattened. Wind pressed down hard, carrying something sharp and final in its breath. Snow came fast, thick, and without warning. By morning, drifts swallowed fence lines. By nightfall, the temperature fell so hard it erased every careless assumption made that autumn. This was not just a storm. This was the beginning of a winter that would not forgive shortcuts. And while iron stoves roared themselves empty across the prairie, one unfinished-looking cabin was about to reveal the difference between heat that burns and heat that lasts. Elias Holmgren did not arrive on the prairie empty-handed. He carried no heirlooms, no money worth mentioning, no tools that marked him as unusual among settlers. What he brought instead was harder to see, and harder to explain to men who measured wisdom by speed and muscle alone. He brought memory. Long before he ever saw the open grasslands of the American interior, Elias had learned what cold truly meant. Not the kind that surprised you overnight and passed in a few weeks, but the kind that settled in for months, pressed its weight into stone walls, and punished every mistake made during construction. He was raised in a coastal northern village where winter dictated architecture. Homes that were not built to impress, or even to feel comfortable at first glance. They were built to endure. Thick walls, dense materials, fires that burned hot for a short time, then disappeared, leaving warmth behind without flame or smoke. As a boy, Elias had watched elders tend their stoves with a discipline that looked almost religious. One firing in the evening, one in the morning. No frantic feeding. No waking in the dark to chase the cold away. The walls themselves worked through the night, releasing what they had stored while the family slept. Heat was not treated as something to be chased. It was something to be held. When Elias crossed the ocean and moved inland, he quickly noticed how differently Americans built. Speed mattered more than patience. Cabins went up light and fast. Stoves were thin and eager, glowing red while the fire burned, then surrendering every bit of warmth the moment the flames died. To most settlers, this seemed logical. Why hide heat inside stone when metal could radiate it instantly? Why spend weeks building mass when a single stovepipe could make the room feel warm by supper? Elias understood the temptation. On the frontier, time was survival. Every day spent hauling stone was a day not spent hunting, cutting wood, or expanding land claims. Efficiency ruled every decision. But efficiency, Elias had learned, depended on what problem you were solving. Back home, the question was never, how warm is the room right now? The question was always, what will this room feel like at 3 in the morning? The prairie posed the same question, only louder. Here, winter did not simply lower temperatures. It erased margins. A mistake that cost discomfort in October could cost lives in January. And Elias could see, even in his first seasons, that most cabins were designed for average cold, not extreme cold. For burning heat, not storing it. The land itself seemed to confirm his unease. The wind moved differently here, uninterrupted for miles. Snow did not pile politely. It buried, pressed, and stayed. And when the temperature dropped, it did not hover near freezing. It plunged, fast and without apology. Men around him believed they would adapt later. That improvements could wait until spring. Elias knew better. In the old world, winter was respected because it had already killed careless people. Knowledge there had been earned slowly, across generations, through failure that left no second chances. So when Elias laid out stone inside his prairie cabin, he was not experimenting. He was translating, adapting a language of survival learned in another land to a new one that spoke just as harshly. He was not building for comfort. He was building for the night when fire would fail, and stone would be all that remained between life and cold. And the prairie, patient as it always was already preparing to test whether that old knowledge still mattered. To understand why Elias Holmgren's cabin would soon feel so different, you first have to understand how most frontier cabins were designed, and what they were never meant to do. Across the prairie, cabins followed the same pattern. Thin plank walls, sometimes doubled, often not. Tar paper to block the wind. A single iron stove set near the center or against one wall. And rising straight upward from that stove, a length of metal pipe, 6 inches wide, light enough to lift with one hand. When settlers talked about heating, they talked about fire. A good fire meant safety. A roaring fire meant comfort. And when the stove glowed red, men believed they had beaten the cold. But the warmth they felt was fleeting. Metal behaves like a thin pan over open flame. It heats quickly, and it cools just as fast. While the fire burns, the stove and pipe throw heat aggressively into the room. Faces flush. Boots steam. The air feels alive. But the moment the last log collapses into ash, that heat vanishes. The cabin doesn't slowly cool. It falls. Within an hour, the stove is cold enough to touch. Within 2, breath fogs in the dark. By early morning, the room has surrendered nearly all the warmth created the night before. Most frontier families accepted this as unavoidable. They built their lives around the rhythm of refiring. Someone woke every few hours. Wood was added constantly. Sleep came in broken fragments. Children learned to dress without warmth. Water froze in bowls just feet from the stove. This wasn't seen as failure. It was seen as frontier life. What settlers rarely questioned was where the heat went. The iron pipe that radiated warmth so eagerly, while hot, also carried most of that heat straight upward and out of the cabin. The walls, too light to store energy, reflected cold as fast as it arrived. Once the fire stopped feeding the system, nothing remained to hold warmth inside. The cabin depended entirely on continuous combustion. Stop feeding the fire, and the system collapsed. Elias watched this pattern quietly during his first seasons on the prairie. He noticed how quickly cabins cooled, how desperately men guarded their wood piles, how winter nights became a cycle of waking and feeding rather than resting and recovering. To him, the problem wasn't the stove. It was the absence of mass. In his experience, heat was not something you chased from moment to moment. It was something you captured, stored, and released slowly, like water held behind a dam instead of rushing downstream all at once. Frontier cabins had no dam. They burned fuel quickly, wasted most of the heat, and demanded constant attention in return. The system worked only as long as the fire did. When wood ran low or exhaustion took over, the cold reclaimed everything. This was the mistake Elias recognized. Not ignorance, not laziness, but a design built for speed rather than endurance. The prairie didn't punish that mistake immediately. It waited. Let men believe they were prepared. Let iron stoves glow and confidence rise. Then, when winter stretched longer than expected, when fuel became precious and sleep became dangerous, the flaw revealed itself. Elias was not trying to build a hotter cabin. He was trying to build one that would not betray its occupants when the fire went out. And that difference, subtle, invisible at first, was about to separate discomfort from survival. Elias Holmgren began his work where no one expected it, inside the cabin. Most men treated the interior as the final step. First came the walls, then the roof, then the stove. Anything beyond that was considered improvement, something to worry about after the first winter had been survived. Elias reversed the order. Before his cabin even smelled of smoke, he marked out a square on the packed earth floor, just off-center from where the stove would stand. He measured twice. Then he dug, 18 inches down into clay that resisted every shovel strike, as if the ground itself questioned his intentions. When neighbors stopped by, they assumed he was laying a footing for a chimney outside. Then they saw where the stones were going. Elias wasn't building away from the fire. He was building around it. A metal stovepipe would rise as usual, thin and ordinary. But instead of letting that pipe radiate freely into the room, Elias enclosed it, leaving space deliberately on all sides. Stone after stone, stacked thick and tight, forming a column where others expected empty air. The reaction was immediate. Men leaned against door frames and shook their heads. One laughed outright. Another asked if Elias planned to build a church tower in his cabin. Someone pointed out that stone would only steal heat from the room. Someone else insisted the pipe would crack, the draft would fail, and smoke would fill the space. All of them spoke from experience. Experience with iron. Experience with speed. Elias listened, nodded once or twice, and kept laying stone. On the frontier, disagreement was rarely subtle. Advice came freely, often loudly. A man who ignored it risked more than ridicule. He risked being seen as unreliable, unteachable, unsafe. Elias understood that. He had felt it before. But he also understood something deeper. That most frontier knowledge was shaped by what worked quickly, not what worked well. Few men had the luxury to experiment. Fewer still were willing to be wrong in front of their neighbors. Elias wasn't experimenting. He was committing. Each stone added weight, hundreds of pounds, then more. The floor beneath had to carry it. The footing had to be right. Mistakes here wouldn't mean discomfort. They would mean collapse. Still, he worked steadily. He left a narrow air gap between pipe and stone, just wide enough for heat to move, just narrow enough to be controlled. Near the base, he left a small opening for ash and inspection. At the top, he shaped the stone so air could rise and circulate before escaping. To an untrained eye, it looked wasteful. Too much stone, too much effort, too much faith in something that hadn't been tested here. Neighbors counted the days. They counted the stones. They counted the time Elias spent hauling instead of chopping wood. Skilled labor like that wasn't cheap, even when a man did it himself. By late September, most cabins stood finished. Wood piles were stacked. Fires burned nightly. Men spoke of being ready. Elias's cabin still looked incomplete. Inside, the stone column rose silently, unimpressive in its raw form. It didn't glow. It didn't promise comfort. It offered no immediate reward. That was the hardest part for others to understand. Frontier life taught men to trust what they could feel right now. Heat that burned your face. Light that chased the dark. Smoke that proved a fire was alive. Elias was building for a moment no one wanted to imagine. The night when exhaustion would win. The night when wood would be scarce. The night when fire would die. And as the first hard winds of October began to scrape across the prairie, the question lingered unspoken in every mind that passed his door. Was Elias Holmgren preparing wisely, or burying himself under stone for nothing? Winter was about to decide. What Elias Holmgren was building did not look impressive while the fire burned. That was the mistake most men made when judging it. On a cold evening, a thin iron stove puts on a convincing show. The metal heats fast. The pipe glows. You can feel the warmth on your face from across the room. It feels powerful, immediate, alive. But Elias wasn't interested in what happened during the fire. He cared about what happened after. In simple terms, metal behaves like a shallow skillet. Place it over flame, and it heats quickly. Remove the flame, and it cools just as quickly. Nearly all the energy you put into it is gone within minutes. Stone behaves differently. Stone is closer to a cast iron pot left in the coals. It resists heat at first. You can burn hard for an hour and still feel little change on the surface. But once stone warms, it does not give that heat back easily. It releases it slowly, steadily, without flame or smoke. This is what Elias understood. He wasn't trying to make the fire hotter. He was trying to slow time. When his stove burned in the evening, the metal pipe inside the stone column still heated quickly. Hot gases rushed upward as they always did. But instead of escaping directly into the room and out the roof, that heat was forced to pass through a narrow air space, trapped between pipe and stone. Hot air rises, but when confined, it circulates. As the air moved upward through that gap, it brushed the inner surface of the stone again and again, transferring heat with every pass. The stone absorbed it gradually, inch by inch, until the entire column held warmth like a reservoir. During the fire, the outer surface of the stone remained modestly warm. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that impressed visitors. This was not radiant heat meant to dazzle. It was storage. By the time the fire burned down to coals, something important had happened, something invisible. The stone was no longer cold. It was saturated, and once saturated, it began to work. As the metal pipe cooled, the stone did not. Heat moved back the other way, outward into the room, slow and even. No spikes, no collapse. Just a steady release that matched the cabin's loss to the cold outside. This was the key difference. Most frontier cabins experienced violent temperature swings. Hot near the stove, cold at the walls. Comfortable at sunset, dangerous by dawn. The air never settled. The body never fully rested. Elias's system aimed for balance. By burning one concentrated fire, hot, clean, and short, he loaded the stone with energy. Then he let the mass do what metal never could, hold that energy through the night. There was another advantage few settlers considered. A short, hot fire burns would more completely. Less smoke, fewer unburned gases, more usable heat per log. Instead of feeding the stove every hour, Elias burned deliberately, once in the evening, once in the morning. Fuel became predictable. Sleep became possible. To men raised on constant stoking, this seemed backwards. Why stop feeding a fire when the cold was still out there? Because Elias wasn't fighting the cold with flame. He was letting stone fight it with patience. The prairie didn't care how clever a system sounded. It only cared whether warmth remained at 3 in the morning. And that was the moment Elias had designed everything for. The fire could die. The stone would not. The storm did not announce itself. There was no gradual warning, no gentle shift to give men time to reconsider their preparations. One evening the wind merely stiffened, carrying a sharper edge than usual. By morning, the prairie had changed its mind entirely. Snow came sideways. It scoured the land flat, erased tracks between cabins, and pressed itself into every crack left by hurried construction. By midday, fence lines vanished. By nightfall, drifts piled against cabin walls like frozen waves. The temperature fell fast, too fast for comfort. Inside most cabins, stoves were already burning hard by late afternoon. Iron doors glowed dull red. Pipes radiated fiercely. Men fed wood without thinking, chasing warmth before it escaped. For a few hours, it worked. Cabins felt hot, almost stifling. Boots steamed near the stove. Faces flushed. Children were told to stay close to the fire, where comfort still lived. Then, one by one, the fires burned down. In the rush of the storm, no one noticed the moment it happened. The last log collapsed into coals. The iron pipe lost its glow. And the warmth, so confident an hour earlier, began to drain away. By midnight, the change was unmistakable. Air grew heavy and still. Breath became visible. Walls that had felt neutral at supper now pressed cold back into the room. Men woke in the dark to feed their stoves again, hands stiff, movements clumsy with sleep and cold. This was the pattern they knew. In Elias Holmgren's cabin, the night sounded different. There was no frantic movement, no repeated opening of the stove door, no cycle of roaring heat followed by creeping cold. His fire burned early and hard, just as it always did. By the time the storm reached its worst, the flames were already dying. The metal pipe cooled quickly, surrendering its heat without ceremony. But the room did not collapse into cold. The stone column stood quietly beside the stove, warm, not hot, not dramatic, but alive with stored energy. The heat it released did not rush. It spread outward slowly, filling the cabin evenly, touching the floor, the walls, the air itself. Elias sat near the stone as the wind hammered his walls and listened. Snow hissed against the roof. The cabin creaked under pressure. Outside, the world froze into something hostile and absolute. Inside, the temperature held. Not perfectly warm, not luxurious, but steady. When Elias lay down to sleep, the fire was gone. The room was still comfortable enough to rest without haste, without fear. The air no longer smelled of smoke. The stove made no sound. Hours passed. Outside, the storm deepened. Snow climbed higher. Wind screamed across open ground, dragging the cold down into the land itself. In other cabins, men rose again and again, feeding wood into glowing mouths, fighting the same battle every hour. In Elias's cabin, the stone did the fighting. At 3 a.m, when iron stoves elsewhere had long since surrendered, the air inside his cabin remained livable. Water in a cup near the wall stayed liquid. Breath did not burn the lungs. The cold pressed from outside, but it did not win. By dawn, the prairie lay buried and silent. Men stepped out of their cabins stiff and hollow-eyed, faces marked by a night without rest. Smoke still rose from chimneys where fires had been fed until morning. From Elias Holmgren's roof, no smoke rose at all. And for the first time, some of his neighbors noticed that absence and wondered what it meant. By the second week of storms, exhaustion began to show. Across the settlement, nights followed the same brutal rhythm. Fires burned hot in the early evening, then faded. Cabins cooled. Someone stirred. Someone rose. Wood was added. Sparks jumped. Heat surged again, only to disappear a few hours later. Sleep came in fragments. Men learned to wake before the cold became dangerous. Women slept lightly, listening for the moment the room went still and heavy. Children curled tighter into blankets, their small bodies losing heat faster than the adults around them. This was not fear. This was routine. No one spoke of it as suffering. On the frontier, broken sleep was considered part of the price of survival, like blisters or hunger. You endured it because there was no alternative. Except quietly there was. Elias Holmgren slept through the night. Not because he was stronger, not because he was careless, but because his cabin did not betray him when the fire died. Each evening, he followed the same discipline. A short, deliberate burn would split evenly. The stove fed fully, then left alone. By the time darkness settled thick outside the walls, the stone beside him had already absorbed its charge. When Elias lay down, there was no anxiety in the air, no sense of racing the cold. The room felt stable, as if it had decided to stay the way it was. Hours passed without interruption. While others rose at midnight, Elias slept. While others fed glowing stoves at 2 a.m, his cabin remained quiet. The stone released warmth slowly, steadily, like a breath that never ran out. The difference became clearest just before dawn. In most cabins, this was the most dangerous hour. Fires had burned down. Bodies had cooled. The cold reached its deepest point while men and women lay exhausted, slow to wake. In Elias's cabin, the air at that hour was cool, but alive. Cold enough to remind you it was winter. Warm enough to move without stiffness. Warm enough that water did not freeze. Warm enough that breathing felt normal. He rose once, near morning, not in panic but by habit. He placed a hand against the stone. It was still warm. Not warm from fire. Warm from memory. Word of this difference did not spread loudly. Frontier pride does not allow easy admissions. But people noticed. A woman mentioned that Elias never seemed hollow-eyed at breakfast. A man remarked that his woodpile didn't shrink as fast as expected. Children lingered near his cabin during the day, drawn by the steady comfort inside. No one asked questions yet, but the idea had taken hold. What if winter didn't have to be fought every hour? What if warmth could be held, not chased? On the frontier, survival often came down to small margins. An extra cord of wood, one less trip into the night wind, a few uninterrupted hours of sleep. Elias Holmgren's stone column did not roar. It did not glow. It simply made the night pass. And as the storms stacked one upon another, that quiet difference began to matter more than anyone wanted to admit. By January, the prairie stopped pretending. Storms no longer felt like interruptions. They became the season itself. Snow lay layered and heavy, packed by wind into drifts that rose higher than fences and pressed against cabin walls. The sun appeared rarely, and when it did, it carried no warmth, only light. What unsettled the settlers most was not the cold. It was the length. Most men had planned for a winter that would loosen its grip by early spring. Wood piles had been counted, supplies measured. Everything was calculated for a season that would behave as expected. This one did not. Each week of deep cold burned through fuel faster than anyone had planned. Iron stoves demanded constant feeding, and constant feeding demanded wood. By midwinter, stacks that once looked generous now looked dangerously thin. The arithmetic was simple and merciless. Cabins built for continuous combustion consumed wood at an unforgiving rate. Fire burned all night, every night, with no pause. Miss a feeding, and the temperature collapsed. Keep feeding, and the pile outside vanished. Men began to notice the change. Axe heads rang longer in the frozen woods. Sleds groaned under heavier loads. Days that should have been spent repairing tools or resting were swallowed by the need to cut more fuel. The frontier narrowed to a single concern: keeping the fire alive. In some cabins, choices grew darker. Fence rails disappeared. Crates were broken down. Furniture grew thinner as legs and panels were fed to hungry stoves. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone understood what it meant. Fuel was becoming survival. Elias Holmgren watched this quietly. His own routine had not changed. One deliberate burn in the evening, one in the morning. The stone column continued its work without complaint, releasing stored warmth hour after hour. His woodpile shrank, but slowly. While others burned through weeks of fuel in days, Elias measured his consumption with calm certainty. He had built a system that stretched each log, extracting its heat fully before letting it go. The difference was not dramatic at first, but over time, it became impossible to ignore. Where other cabins felt brittle, hot 1 hour, cold the next, Elias's remained steady. Where others smelled constantly of smoke, his air stayed clear. Where neighbors spoke of running out before spring, Elias still had wood stacked against his wall. This was not luck. It was design. Winter did not punish everyone equally. It punished inefficiency. It punished systems that depended on constant attention and endless fuel. And as the season dragged on, the prairie revealed which cabins were prepared for hardship and which were merely hoping it wouldn't last. The cold pressed harder each night. But inside one quiet cabin, stone continued to give back what fire had given it weeks earlier. And for the first time, the community began to understand that survival was no longer about how hard you worked, but how wisely you had built. Change on the frontier rarely announced itself. There were no meetings, no speeches, no public admissions of being wrong. Pride ran too deep for that. But as winter tightened its grip, small decisions began to shift the shape of the community. It started with the children. On the coldest nights, when the wind screamed across the prairie and cabins groaned under the weight of snow, parents made choices they never thought they would. Without explanation, without ceremony, children were wrapped in blankets and walked through drifts to a nearby cabin that no longer filled with smoke. Elias Holmgren's door opened without question. Inside, pallets were laid along the floor. Coats hung near the stone. Bodies gathered close, not to the fire, but to the warmth that lingered even when the stove was quiet. No one commented on it. No one asked how it worked. They only noticed that the night passed. Elderly neighbors followed. Joints stiff from years of labor found relief near the stone column. Breathing came easier. Sleep deepened. In a season when rest had become a luxury, Elias's cabin offered something rare: recovery. No one thanked him publicly. Frontier culture didn't work that way. But word moved quietly, carried by observation rather than praise. Men began stopping by during the day, lingering longer than necessary. They traced the outline of the stone with their eyes. They listened when Elias spoke about footing depth or spacing, not as advice, but as explanation. The questions grew more precise. How thick was the stone? How much space between pipe and masonry? How long did the warmth last after the fire died? Elias answered simply, not in terms of theory, but in terms of labor. Days spent hauling stone. Evenings spent fitting courses. Patience instead of speed. What surprised the men most was not the comfort. It was the consistency. Iron stoves could impress visitors for an hour. Elias's system worked when no one was watching. At 3 a.m, at the coldest hour, when exhaustion made mistakes fatal. By late winter, stone began appearing in unlikely places. A wagon load left near one cabin. A shallow pit dug near another. Nothing announced. No one admitted copying. But the pattern was clear. Knowledge was spreading the way frontier knowledge always did, through proof. The prairie did not reward pride. It rewarded results. And Elias's results were impossible to argue with. One night, during the worst cold of the season, several families stayed together in his small cabin. Space disappeared. Privacy vanished. But the stone column held. The fire burned once. The warmth stayed all night. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. The settlers stopped seeing the stone as excess. They began to see it as infrastructure. Winter was no longer an individual battle. It had become a shared lesson. And without ever saying so, the community accepted what Elias Holmgren had known all along. Out here, survival wasn't about proving toughness. It was about building something that worked when nothing else did. Spring arrived quietly. There was no single day when winter ended. The cold loosened its grip inch by inch. Drifts slumped. Snow darkened and pulled away from cabin walls. Water began to move again, slow and brown beneath the ice. When the prairie finally exhaled, it revealed what the winter had taken. Some cabins stood warped and scarred. Their walls blackened from months of hard burning. Chimneys cracked where extreme heat had met frozen air. Floors sagged beneath the memory of wood piles stacked too high inside. In a few places, empty frames marked homes that had been abandoned when fuel ran out. Winter had kept score. Elias Holmgren's cabin showed little sign of the struggle. The stone column stood unchanged. No cracks, no shift, no damage from months of heating and cooling. The mortar held. The floor beneath it remained true. And outside his door, seasoned wood still rested in stacks that had not been exhausted. The difference was not dramatic. It was structural. Men walked the settlement in early spring, noting what survived and what failed. No one laughed now. No one spoke of wasted effort. The conversations were practical, stripped of pride. Where did the heat last? Which cabins stayed livable when fuel thinned? Which systems demanded constant attention, and which allowed rest? Elias did not lecture. He showed. When asked, he explained in plain terms. Build for the worst night, not the average one. Trade effort early for endurance later. Use materials that remember heat instead of wasting it. There was no celebration of innovation. Frontier culture had little patience for that. But the lesson settled deep. The following autumn, stone appeared again, this time openly. Cabins were modified. New ones were built heavier from the start. Fire was still respected, but it was no longer trusted alone. What endured was not a single design, but a way of thinking. The men who survived that winter were not the fastest builders. They were not the loudest. They were the ones willing to look foolish while preparing for a night no one wanted to imagine. Years later, the story would be told differently. Children would say that one cabin stayed warm when all others froze, that people slept there when the cold was worst, that a quiet man built something strange, and it worked. But the truth was simpler. Elias Holmgren did not defeat winter. He respected it. He built as if the prairie would test every weakness, and he was right. And that is the lesson the frontier leaves behind for anyone willing to listen. Survival does not belong to those who build fastest. It belongs to those who build for the moment when everything else fails.